the corporations aren't paying their fair share of tax. I mean, it's not a radical idea. Everybody believes that. I've never put to a focus group, do you think the big corporations in Australia are paying their fair share? People laugh. Of course they're not. Do you feel a bit like maybe there's sort of two systems where there's a sort of a legal system for the rich and the big corporations and they can get away with what they want, and there's one for you where you sort of just go, they just go, duh.
Big shout out and welcome to our latest Patreon subscribers, Adrian Boothman and Rebecca Thistleton, who of course is a longtime friend of the show and a yearly guest host of our International Women's Day episode. Thanks to both Rebecca and Adrian, we appreciate you both. One quick apology before the start of today's episode. It turns out my mic wasn't working, so the audio is not up to its usual standard. It's still a great conversation and well worth a listen. Thanks to John Armitage, who is a font of knowledge in this particular area of campaign expertise. So enjoy. We are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And Dunn Street celebrated its 6th birthday not so long ago. We always have a bit of a social event, invite sort of, colleagues, past, present, future, friends and family. And I had someone come along and it was only at the end of the night. I went, I never got a chance to speak to John Armitage. So the only way to circumvent that is just to invite him on the podcast and we can just talk about what we're going to talk about anyway, and then you'll get to eavesdrop on our conversation. He is one of the most talented and respected political campaign and social researchers on the left. It's great to have you back on the show, John Armitage. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Great to be here, mate. I'm looking forward to the chat.
I mean, the last time you and I spoke on the pod, I think it would have been the middle of last year, and we were sort of talking about the Albanese government and where they're going and their messaging and whatnot. Or maybe it might have been before the election from memory. But obviously a lot has happened basically since we last spoke. We've had a South Australian election. We've had this rise of One Nation, both in the polls and then that translated into actual votes. So it's not just, opinions. It's actually ballot papers being completed in favour of One Nation. We've got a war overseas. We've got these economic conditions that are once again uncertain. We've got an election in Victoria later this year. We've got an election in New South Wales in March next year. And we're still trying to work out how do we, we've got a budget coming up and, on the pod over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've had economists on talking about this is sort of not a now or never moment for the Albanese government, but this is a prime opportunity for them to make some actual structural reform in terms of tax reform and how the economy's set up. So lots of things to talk about, but I wanted to get you on to talk about it from the standpoint of, you do a lot of research, you do a lot of focus groups, you're always talking to punters and to kind of get your own analysis of where we are and where do we go from here. But to start with, how did we get here? When you look at Australia right now, how do you describe the mood of the country?
I feel like it's probably a bit mixed, right? Because for some people, the cost of living thing is sort of passing us by, and for others, it's belting us right in the face. But I think if I was thinking about the electorate overall, I'd say it's really a bit of a grind. It's just hard. If you look at the stats, about 2008, if you look at wage increases in that last 18 odd years, they're tiny on average, and tiny in real terms, on average means a whole ton of people have gone backwards. They will be particularly people that are less educated, particularly people on lower paid jobs in outer suburbs and regions. So I think sort of either, just sort of knuckling down and trying to get through it, or maybe with a tinge of shitty perhaps might be the way to describe where the electorate's at the minute. Yeah.
Do you think what we're seeing politically at the moment is a temporary phase? I'm talking sort of overall what's happening at the moment, not just specific. We'll get to One Nation a bit further in the conversation, but broadly what's happening in the feeling in the community. Is this a temporary phase or is this something more structural and long-term?
Well, I suppose what I would say when I'm talking to people in research is that the cost of living thing, we've had these crises over the 30-odd years I've been doing this, and they sort of come and go, and they sort of tend to sort of bubble up and then ease off again for, some particular economic reason. This one has just kept on going. I have people talking about that their costs were outstripping the growth in wages, 15 years ago, and it just hasn't stopped, and it's really escalated in the last 18 months or so. I think just, but that's just sitting there. But I would say more deductive reasoning than anything in research. I would say it is absolutely a bigger thing than we've seen in the past. And I'd say that because, and I'll jump into that One Nation point, what has One Nation done that is different? Is Australia actually more xenophobic and intolerant than it was 30 years ago when Pauline burst onto us? Well, probably not. It's probably the other direction, right? So what's different? Well, the fact that so many people are shifting must indicate a significant change in the way that people are looking at our democracy. And I think they're willing to look, for 100 years, it's either been the Liberals or their predecessor or us in the Labor Party. And that's now appearing to be broken. And a sort of a tear the house down sort of movement is getting popular support. That must mean something more than fleeting.
Yeah, the One Nation, the rise of One Nation is interesting, isn't it? Because there's a lot of bit of hand-wringing going on our side saying this is coming for us, as in the Labor Party in particular. And we saw in the South Australian election where Labor did have a swing against it on its primary vote, in its traditional heartland in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, in and around Elizabeth and Salisbury and whatnot. But it really is coming for the Conservatives. And I'm just wondering how much of this rise in One Nation is about the economic conditions, long-term stagnation in wages and living standards, or is it that the Liberal Party, as a representation of a certain type of voter, has just not lived up to the standards of that voter and people are deserting them? Because I think what we're going to talk about in a minute is that there's a view amongst a particular type of voting class that it's sort of a plague on both your houses, both the red team and the blue team. And if that was true, I'm wondering, wouldn't we start to see a bit of movement away from the Labor primary to a more radical left offering that could be perceived as the Greens or maybe the Victorian or the Socialists or something? Why is it only One Nation is benefiting from this mood in the country right now?
I think it's probably, I think it is a serious problem for us too, and I think it is probably a few tactical things that are meaning that it's going to One Nation and it's coming from the Libs more than from us, but we know it is coming from us too. There is no way Malinauskas across that state was going to get a 2% swing against the Labor primary vote. And of course 2PP was great, but there is clearly a pile of votes that came off our pile, went on to One Nation, and then some Libs went on to our pile. That certainly happens if you look at the seat by seat thing. I think tactical things, I would say, is that and I'm not saying people are stupid for this, but people will associate things that happen at the same time as being causing each other. So over the last 20 or 30 years, we have probably seen a change in the demographic makeup of our suburbs where there's more migrants and visibly greater diversity. And over that time, people have been economically disenfranchised. They mistakenly think, and it's not stupid because they're seeing these two things happening at once, but they mistakenly think that one is causing the other. You could argue that our shortage of housing wouldn't be there if we hadn't brought migrants in, but I reckon our pay and living conditions and economy would be in much bigger trouble. The other one, energy is a bit similar too, right? The other thing is, for the last 30 years, our old coal-fired power stations have been dying and needing to be replaced. They've been replaced with clean energy. So what people have seen in that period of time is clean energy is being built and your bill's going up. They're not causing each other. If we're building new coal-fired power stations, your bill would be going up more. But it's not unreasonable to people to link them. One Nation is a really strong voice against doing anything about climate change. They're basically openly climate change deniers. And the other tactical one is that the Libs are just hopeless. Like they just actually are really awfully hopeless at the minute. We've been pretty bad at times too. I don't know if we've been that bad, but I think that's hurting them more. And I think the other one too is my underlying thesis here is that this economic disenfranchisement, you're probably going to go to a party that sticks up for the working person under those circumstances rather than a sort of a capitalism on steroids sort of party like the Liberal Party. So I think that's a bit tactical, but yes, I would say overall this is a seismic shift, and it is important we understand the nature of that. By all means, enjoy the Liberals' demise. I think it could be that serious, but yeah, don't let us not in the Labor Party delude ourselves that this is something that's just happening to them. I don't think that's what's going on.
So unpack that side of the argument. I mean, I think we're all pretty clear about where the Liberal Party are losing votes to One Nation, but where is the Labor Party going to be exposed with respect to losing votes to One Nation? I don't mean geographically. I also mean what type of voter is going to be starting to think about, well, I don't think the Labor Party serves my interests anymore, and then I'm going to park my vote with this new One Nation Party.
So it would help if you were white, I think, because people of colour would be a bit disturbed about One Nation, and it helps if you're less educated. Because one of the things about, not that I've got a university education, one of the things that university teaches you is to be very discerning about the quality of information. And so all of that sort of weird sort of, anti-vaxxer, sort of anti-climate science sort of weird stuff that the libs have embraced, that's sort of One Nation heartland, is going to be more susceptible there. So I think if you had to just say one thing, it'd be education. And the other factor, which is directly related to that, is money. Like, educated people on average, someone with a university education, I think this is still accurate, gets double the pay of someone who doesn't. So it is the people who are the most economically disenfranchised. I was saying that wages haven't really gone up much in the last 18 years, a tiny bit. Well, if that's the average, what that means is some cohorts, not necessarily individuals exactly, because it's 18 years is a long time, but some cohorts are going backwards, and, they are going to be looking for a change that is a bit more radical. And at the moment, that might be One Nation. That will probably move on to someone else if One Nation actually gets elected and are exposed for the sort of crazy, sort of inept mob of loons that they are. But yeah, I think that's where it is a risk to us, and that's a lot of people. A lot of people.
Do you think that folks are voting for One Nation out of ideology or protest against the system? Normally we would assume that if you're a One Nation voter, you're voting along racial lines, or, you sort of name-checked that earlier on about it being the party that's sort of anti-migrant. But is the makeup of the One Nation voter now starting to change a little bit?
Well, it must be, because it's got a whole lot of people they never had in the past. A bit like I was saying before, sort of deductive reasoning, it must be something other than One Nation's position, which has never changed. They started off as I think she started off as anti-Aboriginal, didn't she, in 96, and then moved to Asians, was it, and then Muslims. So, and then, sort of anyone really that's a bit different, I suppose. It's an anti-equality movement, I suppose, more than anything. And I don't think we would have any reason to believe that there's been any particular surge in the last year or two or three that would have said that, the movement against equality has suddenly surged. It's One Nation, I think, is unique among the big parties that sit there. So you've got Labor, Liberal, National, One Nation and the Greens. You and I that sort of watch politics a bit more closely would probably say the Greens is a bit economically left and a bit radical in some ways. I think the people that vote for them, actually you and I both are relatively inner city people, so this makes sense, right? So inner city people that are a bit more seeing the Greens a bit differently elsewhere. They've always underperformed in the outer suburbs and the regions, always. And they've always overperformed in the relatively more educated inner city. So I think that people that vote for them and people like us that follow politics probably do see them as a bit radical, but I think that they're just seen as a sort of bunch of sort of rainbow beanie sporting idiots that protest at things on the negative side, and sort of a sort of a reasonably earthy environmental movement on the other. So I think that they aren't a radical movement. I think in the eyes of most people, One Nation is. One Nation is against everything. And it's a really what are they actually for? I can't think of anything they're for. They're against stuff. So when you feel screwed over and someone is shouting, everything's wrong with this country at the moment, which is essentially exactly what Pauline's been saying for 30 years, that starts to make sense. And it must be making sense because of a change in the landscape rather than the policy prescription, which surely we're less xenophobic as a nation than we were 30 years ago. That has to be the case, surely.
Because, you think about it, what have they done? I mean, Pauline and the party have been around, as you said, for 30-odd years, or since, she first stood up, made that infamous speech. But the rise of their polling numbers really began at the start of this year, and quickly. And I sort of, with my campaign hat on, I think to myself, what have you done to earn those votes? Like, from a campaign treatment perspective, you're not going out there and feverishly knocking on doors. I don't know how much earned media Pauline is getting. I don't know how sophisticated their social media persuasion communication is. I don't know how big their mail program is. I don't think that, have a great deal of money, obviously. Gina Rinehart's flying around everywhere. And I think she's starting to surround herself with smarter political operatives. That's evident. But other than that, is it just sort of that it's got to a point in the last, 6 months where voters, a certain type of or cohort of voter is pissed off and jack about their own existence, and the vast majority of them are traditional Liberal voters and don't know the Liberal Party, look at the Liberal Party now and go, well, that's not the party for me. And there's a small cohort of Labor voters that are doing the same thing and just sort of thinking, what new car am I going to drive, so to speak? I don't want Holden, I don't want Ford, I want a new car. I don't know if they're actually getting the car ads for, I can't think of a racist car. Mercedes-Benz, probably not at 3 other alternatives that they can go and park their vote with, right? The Greens, Palmer, and One Nation. And actually, for a period there over the last 3 or 4 years, I'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between a Palmer candidate and a One Nation candidate.
Yep.
On a polling booth, if you have any chat to them, right?
Yeah.
What differentiates them with One Nation? What I don't understand is, why did One Nation get the bounce? Why didn't Palmer get the bounce? Why didn't the Greens get the bounce? I feel like the Greens are the person who got in the friend zone, and then some new guy came in, and that's the boyfriend. And because you're in the friend zone, you didn't work hard enough earlier. Because One Nation's come in, and now all of a sudden they're the darling of the ball. I'm really mixing all my metaphors here, but that's the bit I don't understand. My campaign political brain can't work out why you.
You know what I reckon it is, Steve, and it's I've always been on this sort of rant that, so whenever I try and distill ideas and I get people reacting to them in focus groups or in surveys and research, right, it's because, it's this values proposition that sits at the core of this, that is this driving thing. And so I'm always sort of on the hunt for, when I'm looking at a project or an idea or a policy or a party or whatever, a campaign, it's like, what's the central values proposition here? But to Pauline Hanson's credit, she would have to be the most consistent in the expression of her values. And I almost feel like I've come around a bit, and Trump made me think a bit like this too, that being clear about your values is really important. To the extent that the values clarity is probably as important, maybe sort of even more important than the actual values. Because there is so much of this waffly sort of weasel words language that just sits there in so much communication that is, I don't think exactly deliberately designed to disenfranchise, but corporate speak, bureaucratic speak, academic speak, these all use words and language that have the effect of excluding people from knowing what you really mean. And even when you are quite clear using that language, you sound like weasel words. I think it is true, I don't really know, but I assume Pauline is too dumb, like actually dumb, to be tricky with her words. So, and Trump's like that too. Trump's really angry with someone. He gets all it's a bad person. That's all he's got. He's not a sophisticated thinker. And so she does do her earned media very well. She's very good at her social media. She works hard at it. But she's also been really, really clear. She has never had any weasel words about it, never backed down. She's consistent in being angry at anyone who's a bit different, and has always been like that. And the Libs have recently started to back this narrative, right? They're saying, the opposition was out there today or yesterday or something, wasn't it? Like, it's the migrants' fault. We're going to wind back migrants and make them be much more like us. So why would you vote for him, weasel words, watered down version of Pauline, when you're going to have the real deal? So I think it's probably been building up for a while. And I think the reason we saw the sudden collapse was the Dunn campaign. He was a good Liberal leader in his posture and the way that he did most things, and then somehow just ran the most diabolically idiotic campaign, and the wheels completely fell off. And in the wash of that, they didn't have a leader that could then grab it by the scruff of the neck. As soon as One Nation went from 5 to 10, then another group of 5 said, well, hang on, there is an alternative, is there? I reckon it was feeding on itself. We can have something different.
But no disrespect to the One Nation voter, but I mean, how many One Nation voters are waiting for the news poll to come out on a Monday morning in the front page of the Australian and go, they're getting momentum, I think I might change my vote?
Yeah, that's probably true, actually. It's probably not so much about that, but it's about the way that it's being discussed in the community. So I don't know that all of them are listening to news poll, but they're seeing it in the news, aren't they? One Nation surge again. It's not you and I dissecting the news poll. It's just the headline in the news. And it's been a lot of headlines saying that they're on the march.
So let's talk about the political implications that we're in right now. You did say the word radical. You were talking about this as a radical political moment. What makes this period different in that it requires some sort of radical approach?
Look, let me put the counter case first. You could argue that the rise of One Nation will probably help befuddle the Liberals in a campaign in Victoria and New South Wales. So we may not need to be radical to win those immediate elections. But for 100 years, the way that the centrist sort of voter would have thought is it's either Labor or Liberals or their predecessor. And it's sort of like you're changing the management team. You're not throwing out the system. Voting for One Nation that is against sort of everything is throwing out the system. And we are part of the system. The Labor Party is, particularly when the Libs are gone, we're going to be the only major political movement that is the system. And we should be aware of that. I'm not saying frightened of that. We should be aware of that. It's important and it is serious. And I would also say that sort of wave of neoliberalism across the world, Thatcher and Reagan, that was really a supercharged capitalism movement in the 80s. And it went unrestrained for 20 years and it seemed to go okay. And then this century, what's happened is that, Australia has done great this century, right? In that last 18 years, company profits in real terms, take out inflation that is, up 29%. That's great. Wages up 2%. Right? So the system doesn't work, does it? Nothing wrong with our economic growth. And it's not all because of capitalism going feral, although a bit of it is. Some of it's just luck. But, this has been a really sustained and really significant kick in the guts for millions and millions of ordinary working Australians. And, when they are rumpled that much, they are going to make the changes required to get something done different. Why wouldn't they? They're being kicked. And we are part of the system. So, we need to understand, as has always been Labor's job, is to reform the system. We are an agent of change. We are a economic justice movement first and foremost, and we are a reformist movement. We're not the Conservatives. We want things to change. We need to lean into that.
I've often heard you say to me that the mistake that oppositions make is that they try and behave like the government. They try and govern from opposition, and the mistakes that governments make is they try and govern from government, whereas they actually continue to be the opposition. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying it's even more significant than that? Not just be a government that looks like it's constantly trying to push for change, but actually they need to do something. Like, to unpack what radical change would look like, that a One Nation voter would see from a Labor government and go, oh, that's what I'm talking about.
I usually think so. I sort of see myself as a bit of a sort of a researcher and pollster. I mean, so campaigner sort of guy. So I would usually not say this because I think it's not my job to say what policy should be. But the absence of a barbecue stopper type policy change across this is for the Libs too. The parties need to be seen to be able to say, we're actually going to do this thing that people could say, yeah, that rings true and makes sense. That seems like part of the injustice that's there that we need to get fixed. So I think there's actually going to need to be big policy changes. And I think I would never have said that in the past. I would have said, most of it really is about just how you position the policies you've got. Make sure that they fit the centre, that they antagonise, your far right sort of opponents, that you divide the opponent's base and unite yours. It's all very tactical and political, right? That's usually our day job. I think that our movement, our Labor Party, needs to come up with some big ideas, and I think the Libs do too. I mean, they need something a bit like they had with that nuclear policy, which just happened to be a really dumb policy. But it was big enough, it was stupid enough in a sense, like to capture and get people talking. It was just wrong, and then they didn't lean into it. That was just part of the whole disaster of their last campaign. But everyone... To keep up with this, we need some big policy stuff that people go, whoa, can you do that? I didn't even know you could do that. Okay, wow, great. I can't think of anything that any of us have done like that for some time. Maybe since Gough doing stuff like, inventing age pensions, no-fault divorce and Medicare. It's that sort of scale of stuff.
You have often said the term to me, offering meaningful benefits to voters. In fact, I distinctly remember writing it down in my journal because we were doing some work on a particular campaign, and you were saying, Stephen, what meaningful benefits are we offering this cohort of voters that's based in these values that you talked about at the start? Is it as simple as that, as offering meaning? Does it come back to that rule that you used to have, which was what meaningful benefits are we offering? Because I often think maybe we talked about the Harris campaign for the US presidentials in 2024, it was difficult to see what meaningful benefits the Harris campaign was offering ordinary Americans, but it was quite clear to see some of them anyway, like no tax on tips and a whole bunch of other meaningful benefits offering service workers, and service workers make up a large part of the US economy. Trump was, whether you like the man or not, was offering meaningful benefits to those voters. In this case, is meaningful benefits, if you're Anthony Albanese and the team getting ready for the budget this year, offering that, or does it have to be something even more radical than that?
I think that it probably does need to be a little bit bigger. I think that we need to be able to say that, you were asking earlier about the opposition's behaving like government and government's behaving like government. One word job description for a politician, advocate. An advocate challenges the system and advocates on behalf of people. And you can be in government for 10, 20 years and still be there advocating for change and agitating for it and wanting it to happen. It's a bit easy to get in the thing, we've been in government forever and say we own everything. Well, you don't have to. You say, I think that's wrong. You can even say you've been wrong if you want. It's usually not tactically smart. But so I think that it needs to be something that says that it's in addition, the meaningful benefits, I think now it needs to be bigger than that, in the sense that just offering people $500 or something, which would be very helpful, but is not going to mean my kid's can afford a house. And it is not going to mean, it's going to mean maybe that next power bill or kids' school uniforms or whatever it might be I can get through, or insurance bill or rates bill or whatever it is, but it doesn't actually change my fundamental problems. So I think it's going to be an acknowledgement of some really serious problems and some shifts that look like they're pretty seismic. For example, we've been on I'm not recommending this, I'm just saying by way of scale, we've probably been as a country on the trajectory of you probably do better I don't know why, but apparently we all seem to agree that cutting company taxes is good for the economy and, gets people to reinvest and whatever. I mean, what about saying these are, companies and or in particular the big ones, they don't seem to be paying much tax at all, and we're going to change the way that we tax them, maybe on turnover or something like that. I don't have no idea if that would make sense or not economically, but it's got to be of that sort of scale that people can go, yep, I can see that you're describing a problem that I agree exists, and that you've got this solution that is to the, I don't know if radical is quite the right word, but commensurate to the scale of the problem that I feel. And then I can see flowing on to be meaningful benefits to me. So I think it's really escalating in terms of having to really line up the acknowledgement of the problem. Your job, even in government, is to campaign against the things that are wrong with the system, even though you sort of own the system. That's actually your job. And I'm sure that's what most backbenchers would feel too.
When the Prime Minister won the last election in a historic landslide victory, albeit though with a reasonably low primary vote, the frame of his campaign narrative was almost a steady hand in times of uncertainty. But I feel like what you're suggesting now is that the government be more of a risk taker from a policy setting. What I'm trying to get my head around is Anthony Albanese and the caucus, the kind of caucus that are prepared to take a risk or be bold in this moment and show the electorate that we can do things different, that we acknowledge that there are serious economic unfairnesses embedded into the system and that we are going to readdress those. But I just think that Anthony Albanese has styled himself as a Prime Minister that is, we are not going to rock the boat. And I think that a lot of that's born out of his time during the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd era, which in the end was an unmitigated fucking disaster. And we threw away what could have been a 4-5-term Labor government and turned into be one election, huge one election win, one draw, and then an absolute pasting. And I think that he's like, I don't want to do that, and I get that. Like I as a campaigner, I just want to win. I just want to win elections. That's my job. And then once you're in there, it's up to you as politicians to set yourself up for the next win. But it just feels like that maybe even though they've got this big buffer, now is actually the opportunity to go take it for a spin and deliver on some things that the community desperately need to readdress this unfairness that exists.
Look, I think I'm 100% with you on the theme of that. I think that's dead right. The thing I just sort of note is it's really dumb advice to tell a leader to be different to what they are. But, it just might be that Albo is the go for this. Like, remember when he eventually sort of changed his mind a little bit, actually backflipped on the tax cuts and said, no, I'm not going to give it to the richest people. And how long have they been setting up this? I would be astonished if it didn't have 70 or 80% support, presumably coming cut to capital gains tax. Both of those things were really popular, really easy things to do, and yet so slow and cautious. Well, if you're going to be radical, maybe being cautious about it ain't such a bad thing, right? So if they can come up with these big ideas, and then if this sort of, I don't mean this in a pejorative, because sometimes it's a really good thing to be boring, and Albo's not this guy that's super exciting, maybe that makes a relatively radical change a bit more palatable. So I'm not convinced that he or the Labor Party is not right, or the right people or the right, movement for this, but yeah, I think it's a really interesting tension we've got to get past there about we need to move in a significant way and, have we got the bottle to have a red hot crack at this? I'm not concerned about the people we've got leading in that sense. I think they can do it. They've got to be willing to make that decision to do it.
So it sounds like you're wanting the Prime Minister to continue to be himself, but the actions of his government can be bold. It's just the way that perhaps he presents it could be quite safe and secure. How Philip Ruddock, the former coalition foreign minister, could get up at question time and got asked a question by the Labor opposition and then just bore them into submission with the most calm, boring responses about foreign policy. And I thought that was always quite a trick. And I think Penny Wong's actually mastered that a bit as well. She was on David Spears the other day, and, David Spears likes to really kind of get in there and ask those nitty-gritty questions that might just touch on a nerve that will get a reaction. And Penny was just steady, monotone. I'm going to bore you into submission. And I wonder if maybe the Prime Minister just needs to be, no, I'm just going to be steady pair of hands. Meanwhile, I'm actually doing this really radical thing, but I am sounding like I'm very, very calm. So let's not overreact, but also be very pleased that the government's trying to do something that's going to try and make your lives better. Is that the tone you want to get from the Prime Minister? So he's not actually no longer being himself. He's still being himself, but what his actions are different.
Yeah, I just think you've got to work with whoever that person's tone and sort of skill set is. For example, that change on it was a pretty radical change, that banning of social media for kids under 16, I think, wasn't it, rather than 18. But anyway, that was a pretty radical thing to do. But it was sort of expressed in a pretty sort of calm sort of a way. Another leader might have come out and said, hang on a minute, these companies have deliberately, and the courts in the States have found this, have deliberately created an addictive product that they know causes harm, including death, to children, and they have inflicted that upon these children, and I am going to ban it, and they are lucky they are not facing criminal charges. Why shouldn't I take their company off them? So a different sort of politician could have done it in that way. So there might need to be some sort of an edge, and I think Albo could do this, some sort of an edge about defining the problem in a more dramatic sort of way, even though his tone and sort of execution of the language about what he's going to do about it could be a little bit more sort of calm and centrist. But you know, I don't think that he ever really articulated what was wrong with social media. I tell you what was wrong with it. Arsehole, gigantic, multi-squillionaire corporations deliberately manufactured algorithms that they unleashed on people, including children, that they knew caused them harm because they were making money out of it. And I don't even know if, maybe it predated me, but I don't even know if tobacco was deliberately, openly targeting children, were they? Well, you know, the tech bros are, and it just seems abominable, and yet they sort of got away with that morally, I thought, through this. There's a huge amount of support for that in the public, I think. I don't know about kids, but huge amount of support for that in the public. We didn't really express it as a radical idea or an angry idea. We could have. I think even Albo could have if he wanted to, in that very centrist way of his.
Well, and I think I want to sort of build on that point as well, because you're right, like, one of the post-election analysis of the 2019 campaign was that we took a very aggressive suite of policies to the electorate that they fundamentally didn't understand why we needed to do that then, was the view. And I'm sure that could be debated by some, but that I kind of subscribe to that theory that a lot of people didn't actually understand why we needed to change things like franking credits and the like. And in fact, some people didn't even understand what franking credits are. My accountant every year sits down with me and tries to explain to me franking credits. And I say, Rowan, don't bother. Doesn't matter. Just you do it. I don't care.
It's like one mechanic in the carburetor, right? Like,
how much is it? I'm literally getting a headache just listening to you right now. But I think that the reason why the decision around banning young children from social media platforms didn't need to be explained by the government was because every damn parent knew that it was a problem, and in fact they were kind of looking for someone else to be to create a solution for them, because every parent that I'd spoken to said they were throwing their hands in the air going, I give up. I tried everything. I did the iPads in the basket on top of the fridge after a certain time, and the kids were getting the stool out and sneaking out of their bedrooms and stealing the bloody iPads. We were at a loss. We didn't know what else to do. So when this policy came in, it was like, oh, thank God someone's doing something about it. And I'm wondering, like, in, say, maybe around housing, I don't think we need to explain to voters now the unfairness of our housing conditions or economy or whatever you want to call it, or the inability for young people to basically buy a home. I don't think we need to explain that to young people or their parents who are having to remortgage their home to support their kids so they can actually get enough money to take out a loan. So I think that a lot of the things that we wanted to do in 2019, we probably could just do, like the capital gain stuff, all of those kind of things. I think that they could politically easily manage that now, because everyone will be like, thank God, because right now the system isn't working.
Yeah, look, I would just to sort of reflect on 2019 where we had a lot of interesting policies that weren't overly radical. We didn't lose that by much, and we lost that on the campaign, which didn't have a theme. They had a theme, the tax bill you can't afford, bill being the bill shorten, and we didn't have a theme. I mean, we had a lot of policies. Most of them were fine. A couple of them, were difficult to explain, but entirely safe for almost everybody. But we lacked a theme. And if you don't have a singular proposition, one single-minded proposition in any campaign, you can have a lot of things under it. It's got to be one single thing, and you don't win. So we didn't lose by a lot. So I think that wasn't so much a diversity of policies thing as a lack of an umbrella idea that drove the meaning of those and brought them together. And when you get that right,
if I can interrupt you, John, for a second, but to build on that, the bill that you can't afford, they could point to policies that Labor were offering at the election, and it freaked out voters.
Yeah, that's right. But also that's always the case, right? Like you can always point to something to make your theme. They have one theme and they go, they've got 103 policies, and they just find two and mention it. I mean, Morrison would just go and do a press conference about something completely nothing to do with taxes and make it a tax bill you can't afford thing. And he's not very brainy dude, I don't think, but he's an ad guy. He understood single-minded proposition, which is ad guy's language for what's the ad trying to say, and he understood that. So I think that, what is the value proposition behind the radical? No, I don't know if radical is quite the right word, but the big policy idea. Yeah. What's the fundamental idea? And even on that one you say about the social media, everyone knew the problem. Yeah, but you know what? And this capitalism does this all the time. Like it says, if you haven't got money, well, mate, you should have been smarter. You should have worked a bit harder. It doesn't say because the system screwed you. Like you need to be political to think like that, right? So we didn't blame anybody. Exactly the way you described parents on that was, I've tried everything. And what can I do? I feel like a bad parent. Jesus, no, assholes. And no one ever bothered to blame the assholes. And considering that effectively this economic disenfranchisement that is sort of leading to this potential rupture in our democracy, even threat to our democracy, is sort of capitalists off the leash, maybe we should be pointing at that as the problem. And not necessarily in a sort of a, 1960s communism versus capitalism sort of dumbass way, but hang on a minute, there's a fair set of rules here. And let's play this fair and articulate that, which I think Labor could be great at. That's what we all believe and think about a lot when we examine and think about policies and ideas and people. So I think there's place for it. I don't think we should be frightened of big ideas or even a lot of ideas. Just got to be clear about the values that are motivating us. That's always the thing that matters. You can do big stuff if you've got a clear values proposition. For us, what's been happening over this economic disenfranchisement over the last decade or two is nobody has provided an answer except Pauline Hanson, who said it's all the migrants' fault. And it's a little bit true on housing because we would have had a shrinking population without immigration and then we wouldn't have had a shortage of houses. But the real issue is we haven't built enough houses, which is not really anything to do with migrants, particularly. You could argue it's a bit related. All the rest of it is just wrong and not true. But who else has provided an answer as to why you have been screwed for 20 years? No one is saying because the corporations aren't paying their fair share of tax. I mean, that's not a radical idea. Everybody believes that. I have never put to a focus group, do you think the big corporations in Australia are paying their fair share? People laugh. Of course they're not. Do you feel a bit like maybe there's sort of two systems where there's a sort of a legal system for the rich and the big corporations and they can get away with what they want, and there's one for you where you sort of get screwed? They just go, duh. Obviously there is. So there's plenty of absolutely centrist energy behind identifying, I would argue, passionately the actual villain. But even if you just had it as a stalking horse, as a sort of a bullshit proposition for your lefty campaign, people are buying it. People believe that the corporations are screwing them more than they believe the migrants are. But who's saying it? who's identifying the problem that then your significant policy prescription directly addresses. Pauline Hanson's got one. Stop them coming in. Kick them out. Send them back where they came from. Simple policy prescription that directly resolves the problem that she describes. We aren't describing the problem, so our solutions look tactical and minor.
So with that in mind, we have an election in November this year in the great state of Victoria. If you're advising the Allen government heading into this election, what would the core message be, or what is the values proposition to the voters of Victoria?
I think that as a sort of a lefty state, I'm not sure this will be true after the next election, I did the sums on it, 14 state and federal elections this century in Victoria. We lost one of each, one by 0.5%, which was the Latham one. I just lost that. 2PP in this state federally. One by 1%, which Baillieu won. So it's a pretty good state. Average is 54 state, 53 federally, 2PP. So it's a good place to be for a lefty and for a Labor Party person. If you look at that, the thing that really underwrites all lefty votes is people under 50, and in particular, the younger you get, the more. Like, I know the Greens are getting them and whatever, but they'll end up in our pile, or we won't lose government because the Greens get too many votes. So if you think about young people, and they are the lowest paid and the most screwed over by the current economy, I'd probably be thinking about a thematic idea that's about for the future, for the kids, for the next generation. Lovely thing about people in their 40s and 50s that are parents of the young adults is that they, whether their parents or not, care about them, and the grandparents care about them too. It doesn't actually go the other way as much. I love young people, but they care as much about the previous generations as the previous generations care about them. So an oldster will vote for something that's good for young people. I think that's a fine thing to do. So I'd be looking at that. And if I want to bring together two genuine policy things that I think are reasonably unequivocal, with a political strategy on that. I'd probably say first one would be just make a bit of a pig of yourself on climate. So we are going to build these wind farms and these solar panels, etc. And we know it's going to cause tension in local communities, and we should absolutely be sympathetic to some people who don't like the look of them. Some people don't mind the look of them at all, but I'm genuinely sympathetic to someone who feels that their landscape is being changed. But we're going to do it, and we're going to own it, and we're going to push it through, and we're going to expedite planning. And the other thing about it is, and this is a political angle on it, right? So I think it's genuinely a good thing to do, but the political angle on it is, what are the Libs going to do about it? I mean, their parliamentary party and their branches are pretty much committed climate denialists. Well over 70% of Australians want stronger action on climate. More pointedly, I would be a bit inclined, and this has sort of happened anyway, right? Planning laws in Melbourne have changed a lot. Why is Melbourne housing relatively cheaper now compared to 10 years ago compared to the other big cities? Because we changed the planning laws and we said, nah, if you've got a 700 square metre block, you can put 6 units on it or whatever. And that's meant that more homes are being constructed. And some people, it's a minority of people now, really don't like that. And guess what? They attend Liberal Party branch meetings.
And Greens branch meetings as well.
Oh, now, hallelujah, you're probably dead right there too. Yeah, that's a good point. And that way you probably split their people. So I think that in both cases, that being really pushy on investment but sort of cheaper, planning on renewable energy and housing would both be popular overall and would genuinely annoy some people who've got a genuine case, who would be a minority, who would capture the Liberal Party and shout very loudly, those assholes in the Labor Party agree with you lot. It's exactly what we did about Howard's Tampa policy. 30% of us stood up and shouted, that terrible, awful, disgusting, racist arsehole agrees with you. And the Libs will do that on planning, on renewable energy and on higher density housing. And so it's good policies that will genuinely help people and divide and put our opponents in a really tricky spot. I'm not literally prescribing them because I think smarter people than me will be thinking about this sort of stuff, but that's the sort of thing I'm interested in looking at. How do you get something that's meaningful, good, legitimately challenges the system, and both those things do, particularly planning laws, and politically put your opponents in a really tricky spot, and in particular, a tricky spot with One Nation. We want to stop losing votes to One Nation ourselves, but we've got no problem with the Libs votes going there in a sense, in that it destroys our opponent. I'm a little bit in two minds about that, in that what if they eventually win one day, which is a bit of a traumatising thought, but as bad as you think. It's like when we think how terrible George W. Bush was. Can't we have him back?
It's hysterical, isn't it? How things have changed. Can I add on one other to the and I agree with you in terms of investment and putting a lot of weight into planning, high density, as well as renewables for the Victorian campaign. But another one, which has just been a brand strength for Labor since they were re-elected in 2014, is infrastructure and all the things that fall off of that, which is jobs, which is the heart and soul of Labor. That's what Labor promises. We promise that we're going to create more jobs, good secure jobs, good paying jobs, and from that, then you can then raise a family and live a good standard of life, notwithstanding all the issues you talked about at the start of the podcast about wages and whatnot. I guess essentially they're federal matters. But the Victorian Labor government since 2014 has built a reputation with voters that they get shit done, in particular in this space of infrastructure. And it started with the level crossing removals, and then moved on to things like building schools and hospitals and upgrading roads, Melbourne Metro, and now moving on to Northeast Link, or what it's called. And now moving on to even bigger, longer-lasting structural changes, which will redefine the way that our state works around the suburban rail loop, which also, by the way, is a housing
little known, but absolutely
as well. So that density, and we've had Harriet Shing on previously to talk about that. But the last 2 months, this national scandal with the CFMU, the construction division of the CFMU, has seen the Victorian Labor Caucus get a bit shaky and start to blink on this in the face of pressure from the conservative media and from the Liberals. And I think the Liberals felt they were starting to land a blow on us for the first time in a very, very long time. And in a boxing match, when your opponent that you've never had to really suffer any blows from starts throwing a couple of serious punches, it can be a bit of a shock. And I thought that it actually did shock the Labor caucus there a bit, to the point that they almost stopped talking about one of its most important brand strengths leading into an election year, when they've cut the ribbon on a bunch of big projects, and to walk away from that or deregulate, deprioritise that as a talking point or as a key part of your brand, that worries me. And I want to get your reflections on that. How do they lean back into that narrative? Because I think one of the talking points out of that, how I would push back against the Tories, was these are workers you're talking about. These are Victorian workers. These are workers with families that live in the outer suburbs, and you're shitting on them as if they're all criminals. How dare you? Is that the kind of premier you want to be, where you can just treat workers like as if they're common criminals? Because these people have built our city, they've built our state, they've built our roads and schools and hospitals and regional networks and whatnot. And just put it back on them and start to get the Premier with workers standing behind her. I mean, that was one of the great strengths of Daniel all throughout his tenure, was whenever he did major announcements, he was always surrounded by nurses or teachers or AMBOs, first responders, whatever the announcement was. He was always standing with workers, not other politicians. And I'm often nowadays, the pictures on the TVs at night, it's the leader standing with just more frigging politicians. And it now looks like we're just talking to ourselves. And we need to get the people back in the centre of our story. And I think that there's a good story to be told here. And I just want to get your thoughts on: are we a bit shy on this one?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't have. I can think about your point about the workers, and that's a great way to frame that component of it too. But for most Victorian your Victorian listeners and all of your interstate listeners probably wouldn't be aware that there's this sort of sub-brand called Big Build in Victoria. And it's just a little brand stamp that went on a huge number of infrastructure projects that have been done over the last sort of, I suppose, since 2014, I guess, so a long time. And but, you know, when I get sort of these narky sort of libs in focus groups, they keep using that term, Big Build, and they want to associate overspending with Big Build with debt, and then they'll throw in a bit of CFMEU as well. I suspect that the vast majority of Australians would not know what the acronym CFMEU is or stands for, and might vaguely have an idea if you ask them to guess. That U in the end makes me think it's probably a union, but I can't think which one. I'm not joking. Like, people are not in our land, right? Like, we know them, they're our friends. But, you know, notwithstanding the ones that have drifted from their purpose, which, of course, we're angry with. But I think that you sometimes get this little thing, and it sort of comes out of Murdoch and Sky News, and we've discussed this before, where they are running a sort of narrative that is they're trying to radicalise about 3% of the Australian population, so they will be willing to spend $50 a month to listen to be among the 50,000 people who listen to Sky After Dark and pay $40 or $50 a month for the privilege of listening to that crap. So that's a little in message for them, and they're feeling up and confident because they feel like there is some actual substance to some of these issues with the CFMU. There is also some genuine substance to the nature of Victoria's debt. It is in no way anywhere near as catastrophic as the Libs would like to make it out to be, but it's bigger than we'd like it to be, and COVID clobbered us, and, you know, that's annoying. It's not catastrophic. It's just, okay, you know, we've got to just be a bit careful in the future. So I think a combination of those sort of slightly real things, and then, you know, the Libs just really trying to create a brand over here for really a niche little audience. Like, I've never had someone in a focus group, so, you know, when the one little Sky News watcher says Big Builds, and I was like, yeah, I hear that Big Build's terrible. I mean, I don't even know what you're talking about. It just goes over their head. So people like infrastructure, and back to that thematic idea about sticking up for young people and, you know, the planning and stuff and housing and renewable energy, isn't infrastructure for the next generation too? And remember, we had a really similar thing with the desalination plant. It was just really sort of bad luck, good luck. The Victorian government at the time, Braxy and Brumby, to their credit, did not press build on that gigantically expensive desalination plant until it got to the point where if we didn't press it and we didn't get rain, we'd run out. Then they pressed the button and it was nearly finished, and then it rained. Well, you know, and it cost a bomb because, you know, $5 billion plant. And I had Libs in focus groups saying someone would slag off at Labor and the CFMEU because the cost overruns on that. And some Lib would say, yeah, but we've got that for the future. That's there for the next drought. People like infrastructure. It's a good thing. So I think, you know, we've just got to get our language right about it and remind people this is an investment in our future, and that a lot of this big transport, a lot of it we're talking about is transport infrastructure. There's been some health and education too. This city is going to go from 5 million people, Melbourne, to 9 million sometime in the 2050s. Do you think we don't need some fairly gigantic infrastructure projects to make that work? Of course we do, as we do need a radical rethink on our planning laws. So I just think, you know, there are great ways for us to talk about, exactly as you said, as we're, you know, on behalf of working people that are actually getting the jobs here in these big projects, and they're good jobs. People will say, oh, yeah. Oh, you got a job on that, have you? Oh, geez, mate, well, you're doing all right. And it's true, they're good jobs. And then you add in this notion of building for the future and levering off that brand advantage that we've got. And, you know, it isn't going to be as powerful as it was in the past because people recognise that we probably need to spend a bit less, and because, you know, you do something for a couple of elections and it's not as potent for the third one, right? But still, we should absolutely not be frightened of it. There's a great story to tell there, and we should be out there telling it. We need some other stuff too, but, yeah, that's... When you were saying I didn't know that some of the corpus would get a bit wobbly on it. I mean, I'm not wobbly about it at all.
it's funny talking about big build and how some of us may be worried that it's got bad brand connotations now, and think back to when we began the level crossing removals, particularly along the Frankston line, and we were crying because of the close proximity of the train line to the beach. They couldn't go underneath, so they had to go over the level crossings. And the Herald Sun and a bit of an astroturfing campaign from folks that literally lived along the actual line, not the streets back, weren't too pleased about this, and then dubbed it Skyrail, and that paedophiles would be able to ride the train and look in people's backyards. This is the kind of shit that was getting thrown up. And there was a natural thought that go, oh my God, Skyrail, they've given it a name. The level crossing removal program's now got a bad name. It's called Skyrail. This is going to be an unmitigated disaster. And then we did research at head office, and we literally surveyed everyone that either lived along the train line or lived in the corresponding streets back, and got an assessment of whether you thought it was a good idea. Not everyone, but a lot of the people who lived along the train line itself weren't so keen on it. Anyone that lived beyond that street thought it was one of the best things ever. And Skyrail, in the end, the name Skyrail became synonymous with a wonderful piece of good public policy, to the point that, like, my aunties who are all retired, ride Skyrail as if it's like a joyride.
Wonderful view up there.
Yeah, they do. They get a flask and put a cup, they're Scottish, so it's flask, thermos, some tea, cut sandwiches, and go for a ride in the afternoon and have a bit of lunch and have a bit of a gas bag while they get to look over elevated parts of the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. So,
Can I take that a step further, Stephen? Because I am pretty confident that, you talked about this great big infrastructure brand. I believe that Daniel Andrews' infrastructure brand was born of Skyrail, that the Liberal Party created to kill us and got it wrong. And what they managed to do for us for free, no government money spent advertising it, no party money spent advertising it, they said, that arsehole is getting rid of all those bloody level crossings for you. What a prick. And I said, that's what's good. And the people that lived along the line, and I saw this happen as I worked on some of these projects later on for departments and things, that once we actually built that infrastructure that was a lot different to what people thought of as old railway lines, they're really pretty and beautifully designed, lots of landscaping, cost hardly anything in the scheme of things. People in the next one and the next one and the next one, like years later, are going, we'll have one of them. I live not too far from one in Coburg now. It's actually really quite pretty. You elevate the rail, you've got free public open space underneath. It's actually a social improvement in the amenity of a local area. So, be careful what you dump a bucket of crap on sometimes.
Well, absolutely. And if you're looking for contrast messages, I've sort of been thinking, eventually the Victorian Liberals are going to have to put up their own offerings to the people of Victoria about why they should be rewarded with being elected as the new government in November this year. And a lot of things that are coming out of Jess Wilson's team is pause and review. Now, if Victorians are now in the habit, it's like a drug in which they're so used to a government that's just doing things constantly, and the next thing is obviously suburban rail loop, and you've got the opposition coming out saying pause and review. Well, what else are you going to pause and review? Because I kind of like the fact that I've got a government that's actually doing things and delivering on a whole bunch of programs. It's ultimately trying to make
I'm really encouraged by that. I didn't realise they had a pause and review sort of thing. It's not even so much to that specific policy area. It's more just that if that's where they're thinking, they are just hunkering down and thinking, how do we not say anything about anything?
Yep.
I just, Jess Wilson is actually, they did this in South Australia too. I think the Libs have done a good job of picking some decent, presentable people for a change, like the best they've got in a really thin team. But how is Jess Wilson going to handle the question? It's a legitimate question from a journalist, and I hope every Labor Party person is going to be asking her and their friends and family is, so if One Nation outpolls the Liberals, will Jess be happy to serve as the One Nation's Deputy Premier? And if she gets... would she be happy to make a One Nation MP the Deputy Premier instead of the National Party? That's just going to befuddle them. And this is, they're capable of getting votes. South Australia's even less in favour of one nation than us historically, so it's not that they won't get votes, but it's going to be really hard for them because where is one nation toxic? Inner city, upper middle class, everyone, but including well-to-do white people in the only safe seats they used to have.
Yeah.
So they're going to either have to schmooze up to them and look like these disgusting feral pig dogs, or they're going to have to say, no, we've actually changed our mind and we now believe in climate and vaccines and things.
Yeah.
That's hard. I think they are going to have a really tactically difficult campaign, and I think Jess Wilson is probably pretty good, but Jacinta's better. She's been doing this for a long time and she will not get caught out on those tricky ones. And I think that, I know we're a smidge behind in the polls at the minute, Victoria. I'm still backing us. I reckon their befuddlement on the One Nation thing, their inability to understand the cataclysmic nature of what is happening to their party, and I think this is genuinely true, their genuinely thin talent, I think, is going to be a real problem for them.
Can I ask you as a final question before we close out, and I agree with you, I think that the Libs are going to struggle with this two-stream campaign where they've got to try and defend their what's left of their eastern suburban heartland against teal type, Tories, socially progressive Tories, whilst at the same time trying to win seats off of Labor in like seats like Werribee or sort of the outer northern suburbs where they think they're going to have some reward, or even try to hold seats that might hold in the bush. Or they're in a competition with the Nats or whatever, it just becomes a bit complex. What do you reckon, though, about Labor's contrast message to One Nation? Because historically speaking, the way that we behaved in a political campaign is we've got a contrast message against the Tories and we've got a contrast message against the Greens in the inner city. We saw what happens when you don't have a contrast message against another party. In the example of Bendigo at the last federal election, when the Nationals ran a very, very well-resourced campaign. They spent, rumours is they spent around about $1.2 million for the federal seat in Bendigo, and it came down to the wire, and Labor only just hung on, and now they're feeling good about that in terms of taking that same campaign against the Premier in her home seat in Bendigo. And I think one of the things that would have come out of the review is that we need to be able to pick contests where it isn't necessarily Labor versus Green or Labor versus Liberal and have a contrast message against, say, for example, that national candidate in Bendigo. But also now we need to have one against One Nation, because One Nation will be running against Labor candidates, particularly in those northern and western suburban seats and even down in the southeast as well. I just think that we need to be ready to land a blow on One Nation. I thought that South Australian Labor weren't overly prepared for that. You could see Premier Malinauskas grappling with some lines throughout, and it changed at the start. He kind of dismissed them as being, kind of bottom feeders, and he got burnt a little bit by that, and he adjusted in a way. And I don't think the campaign landed on what they wanted to say. I don't know whether they lacked research or if they just weren't so certain about what would shift voters or place uncertainty in the minds of voters. But just to add to this, and I'll let you answer in a minute, but it's funny looking at the Nepean by-election campaigns underway right now, and it's getting quite nasty between the Liberals and One Nation. And so the Liberals are grappling with this as well. They're like, shit, we've got a campaign against us on our right flank. How do we respond to them? How do we present a contrast message? And they're doing the same mistakes that we made initially when we were dealing with the Greens doing it to us on our left. And they're trying to say, I'm looking at some of these, it's risky strategy. If you want One Nation preferences, it could backfire and drive more people to One Nation. So basically saying, will they
also, my vote might be powerful.
Yeah. Will they ever be able to deliver things that we need? Which is exactly what we were saying about the Greens, and it never worked. And it was the second or third thing that we tried before we just realised that actually just be yourself, just be very, very strong, Labor and bold and values driven, and get things done for communities, and they will reward you with their vote. Meanwhile, in the end, the Greens took care of themselves because they just turned out to be full of shit and just promising the world, and everyone wised up to it and realised, well, actually, that's just fanciful. And you can see the Liberals making the same. You're going, oh my God, you're where we were in 2010. But I'm just wondering, we need to be smarter than that, because we're going to have to solve that problem now as well. And I just think making out that One Nation voters are stupid ain't going to work.
No.
And I think that we have to be a little bit. You've always told me, John, don't make process-based issues with campaigns. It has to be values-driven. It has to be about meaningful benefits. So, what are your thoughts on how Labor should approach this one with One Nation?
Yeah, well, can I just sort of basically 100% endorse that point you were making about Labor? The reason I was a bit distracted then is I've got here somewhere, which I've kept from like 30 years ago or something, Labor and proud of it. Think like that as a Labor campaigner. Yet we are the solution to we are economic justice, an economic justice party. If there's one big difference between us and the Greens is that they're sort of, I think, really an equality and an environmentalist movement. We're an economic justice movement, if you really want to simplify us down. So lean into that. That's who we are, and that's the solution to today's problem. Labor Party can be front and centre of the solution to that problem. Just don't overly defend this system when it's screwing people over. But on One Nation, could I just tell you a little bit of a story about the two times. See, the thing about these other parties is, this is true for National Party, Greens and One Nation, is they sort of beat us on the value proposition, right? Because they can afford to be really narrow and purist on their values proposition without ever having to do anything. So both Labor and Liberal get a bit monstered by them on that. And that's why usually the best matchup we can do against the Greens is, look, I think we can all agree we've got to get something done about this climate stuff, but who do you think's going to get that done? So that's the best frame we've got, because we're never going to argue. It's true. You and I would argue talking about each other, but we're not going to probably convince the average Green flip voter that we're more committed to climate action than they are. They own that space because of the nature of being a small party. Our friend David Feening was the State Secretary some 20-something years ago. I was just new in this job. And we did this poll, and there was this by-election after we beat Kennett. It was in a seat called Benalla, and the National Party leader had left. And we were like in front, right? So David said, that's mental. Find out why. I asked them a question, and the voters up there, that, we were just in front, but the National Party voters said, Labor was better at health, Labor was better at education, Labor was better at infrastructure. They were three very important issues to them. The Liberals were better at economic management, but the National Party was better at standing up for country people. And so I went up there to do these focus groups, and I didn't know what to do. I just said to people, I literally told them that. And this woman said, I think what you don't understand, because you're from the city, is that the National Party is for country people. And it suddenly dawned on me that you cannot beat them by saying we're better at health, education, and economic management, because that's not what people are voting for them for. So we wrote this ad because the Libs were allowed to run in that by-election, but they didn't. And this little radio ad said, why aren't the Liberals running a candidate in this by-election? Said one bloke at the pub to his mate. They are. His name's Bill Sykes. Bill Sykes was the National Party candidate. So what we did is I went back and said, David, they've got one leg they stand on. We've just got to kick that out from under them and they're fucked. And, we did actually win that seat. And, Denise was a lovely person. She wasn't a great candidate. Bill Sykes was, and he did win it later on and went on to be a good local member. But we won on that. When I have done stuff fighting against the Greens, you just can't beat them. Like, you show things they have done to cosy up to the Liberals, actual things they've actually done to support the Liberals tactically, to screw us, to make our government look bad. And Green people go, nah, they wouldn't do that. Well, I fucking did. I say, no, they wouldn't do that. The one thing we got them on was a breach of those values when Green people, members of their party, were saying there's bullying and intimidation and branch stacking in their party. We didn't say it. We showed them ads where their people, with newspaper cuttings where their people said it. And the Green voters, the Green Labor switchers who leaned Green, hated it, hated us for showing it to them. But it just wrecked with their world. So all of that long, fun preamble, I think that's the story about One Nation. I think we know how to muck the libs up on this, right, to divide them between the centre and the One Nation policies that they're trying to compete with. But I think for One Nation is appealing to the ordinary fella, man or woman out there, the ordinary knockabout sort of hard-working person who's been economically screwed over. And I think that Pauline genuinely comes across as authentic. I think it's because she's dumb and she's not capable of sounding sneaky. I may be wrong about that. Maybe she's cutting it all dead out. I don't know. But I think that we need to point out that she is massively funded, which I assume we will find out is true from South Australia soon, by Reinhardt or some other gigantically, disgustingly rich miner. And I think that we would talk about Pauline Hanson as a very wealthy person, which she has become, mainly through taking money from One Nation, which gets paid by voters. I think that's true. And I think just disconnecting her and her actions from, and very loyal to the Liberal Party. They're basically in coalition with the Liberal Party. So I don't know quite what the actual execution of that would be, but I think we want to show One Nation to be part of the Liberal corporate elite establishment, which they are, and we should be able to show that it's true. I think that really breaks that thing, not so much for these narky sort of right-wing, sort of bit rednecky sort of Liberal voters who think that if you've got money, you're good. Gina Reinhardt probably worked hard for her money. Well, she inherited it, but I don't know if she's worked hard or not, but, she inherited a fortune and a tax system that gave her a free kick to pillage our nation. Anyway, sorry, I digress. But to just break that nexus with, so the Libs won't, the Libs that might switch to One Nation could still go there with that message, but Labor people will go, oh, she's actually a sort of corporate elite-ish type in ordinary person's clothing or language, if you like. And I think I'd try to find, I don't know if that would land, but I'd be working hard to find a research-based proposition that you could just get that a little snippet of evidence, one thing that could just say, she ain't what she says she is. Because these singular proposition movements like Greens, Nationals and One Nation, you take that away from them, they're nothing. Labor and Liberal are bigger than that, and they're harder to wreck. The Liberals have had to work pretty hard to destroy their brand, systematically chopping away at a lot of things that they represented and stood for.
Well, we are going to find out if what Labor does come up with at the next election and how well that is effective in terms of keeping Labor voters on our side of the ledger and not drifting off to One Nation in November. And also it's a big issue for our comrades in north of the Murray, New South Wales in March next year as well. So, John Armitage, as always, really appreciate your time on the show. I had to jettison a whole bunch of questions because we covered a fair bit already, but we're going to have to get you back on again at some stage and later in the year as we get closer to E-Day in Victoria to talk more about messaging and research and everything else in between. So thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah, great for the chat. Really enjoyed it, Stephen. And happy to get back whenever you like. Good on you, mate.
Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like the show, then join our Patreon community for early and ad-free access to each episode. We regularly take questions and comments from our Patreon members, so get in there if you want to have your say. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.